Hi there. I'm Glenda Humiston. I'm Vice President for Ag and Natural Resources at the University of California, and it is really exciting to be down here this morning. I'm going to be moderating this panel. I'm going to take a few moments to kind of set the stage for it. Then at that point, we're going to have each of our panelists come up. To save some time, I'm not going to do any introductions beyond their name and title. Their bios are in your packet. In fact, all the bios of all the speakers are in your packet, so please give that a look. We've got some really great people here today. And also, when one gets done, the next one will come up, because we're trying to save as much time as possible for Q&A, because we've been having some really great Q&A so far today. So, as you know, this panel is largely folks involved in regulations around ag and resource management. And the real question for this panel is around ag tech, opportunities, roadblocks, how do we move forward? And to set the stage, I was thinking back to when we were having a similar issue. And I couldn't help but think last night in conversations with a few folks, I was reminded about 1994, when all of the state of California was trying to implement the Coastal Zone Act Reauthorization Amendment. This was a huge new expansion of some regulatory authorities Congress had enacted. And California did a rather fascinating thing in that the State Water Board decided to declare the entire state of California coastal zone, so that we would have one set of rules for everybody. And believe me, I know that very intimately, because I was the consultant managing one of the 11 components, the grazing and range management component for the whole state. I had the honor of explaining to cowboys in Susanville and Bishop how they were in the coastal zone. But I got to tell you, they got it. In fact, they were less upset than parts of the state like Santa Rosa that clearly was in the coastal zone, because we had a conversation about how that particular bit of regulation was coming down, and there were opportunities there. And we put together a policy and technical advisory committee to try to find how to really not just implement this, but implement it in a way that was positive for all the players. And I'm a big believer in getting the policy people, the technical people, the academics, et cetera, into the same room, having the same conversation. So January, we spent an entire day going over what were the best management practices that would let us achieve the goals of reducing water quality issues, problems for grazing and range management. We use best management practices from USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, a lot of work from University of California Cooperative Extension, a host of academic and other experts in various fields. And at the end of that day, we came up with a list of about 100 best management practices that the whole room, and by the whole room, I mean Farm Bureau, cattlemen, Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, academics, the whole room, and a lot of regulators agreed, hey, these are good best management practices. The next month we came together and I told them, I said, listen, you could get out of here early today. Yeah, I'll still feed you. I was feeding them well. That's how you get people to meetings, you know. I'll feed you still, but if we get done early, that's great. All we have to do is go down the list of the 100-some best management practices and answer the question of, do they require any of these permits or any other permits? You know, yes, no answers, right? We were there all day long. And this is, I couldn't find all my notes, but this is pretty typical of some of the notes. At the end of the day, that sheet had a handful of yeses and a handful of nos. 90+% of it was maybe or possibly. It was an amazing experience, because for the first time, the regulatory folks in the room, the environmental groups and others were flabbergasted. They're just like, oh my God, we had no idea it was like this out in the field with you folks who were trying to implement it. They just really didn't understand that. It's not that there was malice or some desire to, regulate agriculture into oblivion. That was not the goal. People were just simply trying to make things work, and they just weren't talking to each other. You know, the fish and game people aren't talking to the water people, who aren't talking to the air people, who aren't talking to a lot of other people. So at the end of the day, the good news is, long story short, several more months, we submitted a rangeland water quality management plan for the whole state that turned into a love fest. Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, Cattlemen, Farm Bureau, all the stakeholders, all the regulatory agencies said yes. And in fact, it was the only one of the 11 components for the Coastal Zone Act reauthorization that received unconditional approval from EPA, NOAA, State Water Board, Range Management Advisory Board, et cetera, Board of Forestry. The only one, to this day pretty much, I think, still the only one that's unconditionally approved. And it has been extremely successful. It's been a model we've tried to use in a variety of ways. This is some work that was done by Ag Innovations and the California Roundtable on Ag and Environment on ag regulations. And it's got some pretty good recommendations in there about how to make them work, how to bring the groups together, how to find solutions, how to implement without demonizing and making enemies and running people out of business. Great recommendations. Again, a lot of good forward momentum. And then we have this year. This last 2 or 3 months of legislative bills signed, coming from every single angle on agriculture, has literally made the ag community feel like they are not wanted in this state. I've had many of them tell me that. And I don't think that's true. I think if the citizens of California truly understood the bigger picture of what might be going on here, and if the various agencies and the various committees of the Assembly and Senate, who don't talk to each other, by the way, as they're doing these things, if folks really took a step back and looked at the big picture, like we did in 1994, I think we could find those positive solutions moving forward. We could find the ways to make sure we've got clean water, clean air, thriving agriculture, healthy citizens, access to food, all the things we love. And that's what we're really going to explore on this panel today. Because as we move forward, one of the solutions to a lot of the problems out there is new technologies. And some of those technologies are already controversial. They're running into roadblocks. And yet they really are part of the solution to some of the challenges we face. So with that, I'm going to call up first the first member of our panel, Don. Hang on, Don. So Don Cameron is a member of the California Board of Food and Ag, and you just heard Karen Ross mention that about him. He's also a full-time farmer, and I've actually used Don in giving a lot of speeches because he does one of the best jobs I've ever seen of explaining to people conventional agriculture, GMOs, and organic agriculture, and what are the pros and cons of all three. And there are pros and cons of all three, and he knows them intimately. Following him will be Brian Leahy, who's the director of the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And as you all know, Brian's dealing with a lot of big issues right now. In fact, he and I are trying to figure out how to deal with marijuana because we got a lot of problems around air and water quality around marijuana. My cooperative extension should be helping him solve those, and we can't. We can't touch it because if we do, we'll lose all our federal funding. So meanwhile, the environment gets hurt. It's silly. Following Brian, we'll have Darren Paulhemus come up, and I made sure I pronounced his name correctly, the Deputy Director of the State Water Resources Control Board. And he's going to really talk a little bit about regulation in a larger sense, and I'm really looking forward to that. And then last but certainly not least, from UC Davis, Thomas Tomac, who's the director of our UC Agricultural Sustainability Institute, and he's really going to pull a lot of these pieces together. So with that, please help me welcome Don Cameron.
Thank you, Glenda. It's really a pleasure to be here with this group, local group. I farm probably 30 miles up the road from here, and we are on the front lines of the regulations that have been put forth this last year. I look at 2015 was the year of the soil. I think in California, 2016 was the year of the regulation for the farmer. I tell you what, we have been bombarded by, I think, every direction that we've looked at. And what I plan to do, we're going to take a look at some of the issues that we have with water, labor, air quality, others, and hopefully some solutions. I was told by the Secretary Ross that I have to be creative and bring solutions as well. So that's my goal today. So at the end, I'll try and wrap up with that. So when we talk about water, I think our biggest issue currently is the law that was passed in August of 2014 that talks about SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management. We're currently in the throes of GSA formation. We've got coordination, we've got GSP formation after that, we've got coordination agreements, we've got 5-year reviews. Long term, we want sustainable groundwater management. We realized that a long time ago in our region when we saw decreasing water tables, and we became proactive back in 2000. Well, actually, we've been working on it for quite some time. We currently have a recharge project that's hopefully will be in place in a couple of years. And our option, if we don't proceed with GSA formation and the whole process, the State Water Board will come in and control our region, our area, and essentially tell us how and what we're going to be pumping. So what SGMA has done, it's created the haves and the have-nots. It's identified them. You've got areas that have great water supplies and those that don't. We're looking at reduced pumping, and we're looking at monitoring for the future. There'll be user fees. There'll be pumping fees. You're going to have ground idled, and you're going to have reduced land values. We've already seen Westland's water, some of the ground in Westland's water district. The value has dropped 50% from what it was a year ago. You're going to see lost jobs with this land out of production. And you're going to see creative thinking, and you're going to see partnerships and projects being put together for the future. But I believe ag's at a crossroads right now. You're going to see a much different landscape in 5 and 10 years from now. And there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. We look at water quality. We've got the irrigated lands program. We've got fees associated with that. We've got nitrogen management plans that we need to put together on our farms. We have reporting. We have farm evaluations. We had a coalition approach that was working well. It was accepted by the growers, and that's all been changed. We wanted regions to be identified and work together, and now it's down to the individual grower. We understand there's an issue with groundwater in some areas with nitrates, and it needs to be corrected. But I guess, in the short term, somebody's going to pay for the water to be replaced to the communities where this is affected. But this is not something that happened overnight. We have, as we heard earlier, we have a lot of legacy issues. The person that owns the land now is going to be responsible for the cleanup unless something's changed. So if I bought a piece of ground last year, that's now my responsibility for the last 100 years that it's been farmed. To me, that doesn't seem a fair way to look at it. But there are ways. I guess we can get through that. But there's been cease and desist orders. Growers have received letters. It just turned the ag community upside down, created a lot of tension that I think you've heard some today already. When we look at labor and worker safety, we've got minimum hour or minimum wage increases on the horizon. The overtime bill for all ag workers is a huge issue, and we have heat illness regulations. You know, we went through one of our employees that works for us as an irrigator, and we looked at his 2015 earnings. He earned $47,600 last year, and that doesn't include benefits or anything else, just straight time. With the new overtime law and provisions in place, number one, we will have to work, he'll only work 40 hours a week for us, and now he'll only earn around $24,000. That's a 49% decrease in his pay, and he's gonna have to find a job with someone else, or we're gonna have to figure some way. I don't know what that is yet. You know, growers, we're pretty creative, we're pretty innovative, but there's just such a lack of understanding of what we do at the farm level in Sacramento with the legislature sometimes. I mean, there were discussions that farmers were like slave owners. I mean, you know, we protect our employees, we care for them. Without them, we're out of business. We want the best for our employees, and to hear that kind of rhetoric coming out of Sacramento really hits hard, really hits home. You know, we've dealt with heat illness regulations, and I think we've come a long way from where we are, or where we started. And I think our workers appreciate what we do for them. Air quality. You know, years ago we used to burn everything on the fields. We don't do that anymore. But our problem is, how do we dispose of an almond orchard or a grape vineyard when we chip it and none of the biomass plants are open? So now we're told, well, just incorporate all that back into the ground, and you know, you may receive some long-term benefit, but you know, that's really an unknown for us. You know, we bought into the idea of chipping, removing, and sending to biomass plants, and we paid for it, but we knew what we had in front of us. Now we really don't have a good solution. You know, all of our irrigation pump engines are now Tier 3 or higher for diesel. That added additional expense to our farming operation. You know, there's mandatory truck replacements. That means higher costs for moving our product to the market. And somebody has to pay it, and that's always an issue for us. We deal in commodities, as you heard earlier from Greg Eastep, that we deal in world commodities. Our commodities may go around to different parts of the world, and we have to compete with people in China, in Europe, in South America. It's a world market for many of the things we grow here. Low VOC pesticides, you know, in many cases, they're not quite as effective, and we may have to come back and retreat sooner or with a different material. Where we have, even on our farm, gasoline vapor recovery systems adds to the expense. We have to paint the tanks with reflective paint from the right brand. I mean, we were inspected, and we had to show proof that we bought the right paint to paint our tanks. That's fine. We really try to follow all the rules we can. Farm equipment replacement, we've participated in that. We've updated all of our tractors, all of our farm equipment to Tier 3, interim Tier 4, or Tier 4 equipment. It's a big expense. We believe in it. We think it's the right thing to do, but it's another part of the puzzle that we have to pay for with the crops we grow. Some of the other regulations that we're dealing with, food safety, FSMA. You know, we have good ag practices. We have inspections. We do water testing. It all costs money. We're behind it. We want safe food. We don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper with a problem. We believe in creating the best food we can at the lowest cost possible. I'll touch on composting. You know, we talked about the Healthy Soils Initiative, which is coming up this coming year with CDFA. To get a permit to compost, you have to deal with 4 different agencies. And to me, that's absurd. We're talking about some on-farm composting. We have to deal with the county, the Air District, Cal Recycle, at Regional Water Control Board. And with each step, we have additional fees. Spill prevention, containment basement, written plans, inspections. And, you know, every time we turn around, it seems this year we've been bombarded with additional regulations. And, you know, I'm not going to end on a bad note, believe me, but we just have, we want to be good stewards of the land and what we do, and we want to be sustainable. We want to have a farming operation for the future, for generations. We talked about bringing young people into farming. There's a lot of challenges out there. So what are the solutions for the future? You know, I have neighbors that have quit farming. They've sold their land, they've retired, they've left the area. We have others. I checked into farmland in Oregon, and their comment was, would you guys quit coming to Oregon because you're driving our land prices out of sight, and the local growers aren't happy with you. And we hear that from other growers. Some things you can move, some things you can't. We know we love the ground that we farm. We don't want to leave it. We put a lot of time and effort into getting it where it is. You know, consolidation, what these regulations tend to do is eliminate the small grower. If you look at the dairy industry, you really don't see much in the way of small dairies in California. It takes, you know, you need to be large to be able to deal with the regulations, to hire the attorneys, to you know, hopefully get through and continue to be viable. You know, I look at opportunities in data measurement, water, labor, food safety. Everything needs to be measured. Everything needs to be documented. We have to have excellent records for what we're doing now. We need to look back to see what we've done in the past and see what improvements we're making. So we get to data management. How do we use all this data that we collect? So much of it is collected, it's given to the regulators that we deal with, and I don't think it sees a day of light after that. I don't know where it's used, but we collect the data, we submit the data. I think you know, we've done some work with Olivier and Powwow, and we've talked about monitoring. We do monitoring on our wells. We do a lot of work in the irrigation scheduling department, and just seeing the efficiencies and problems with our wells on the farm. And I told him when we got started, I don't want to be deluged with data. I want to know when we have a problem. And so he set his program up so that I get a text message when we have a problem. We get the text message, we go out, we investigate, we see if we really do have a problem, or if it was a false reading. But you know, with so much data, we can't be looking at everything, every little piece of data that we have. We do need to be specific, and we need to look at problems. Like I say, opportunities, you know, we need systems that are California specific. We talked about people that come to visit our farm that want to sell us something. We get that almost every day. So many times we see systems that are developed for the Midwest. They're based on corn and soybean acreage, and I almost can't blame them. They want to create an app, a product that they can take to, you know, millions of acres. California has a lot of specialty crops. We need something specific for California. I think many times that they're developed, they want to take them, gain a lot of acreage, and have somebody buy their company. I mean, bottom line, that's what's behind it. And I guess I can't blame them. It's a worthwhile goal. We have succession. We spoke about that earlier. You know, the average age was over 60, and you know, I'm in that group. I've been doing this for 35 years and love every day, almost every day. You know, we need more farmers, and they need to be business professionals. But we need all levels. We try to bring interns onto our farm. We have a fellow from Cal Poly, worked for us three summers, hired him full time when he got out of school. We've been trying to bring other people on the farm as well. It's hard to get that program initiated because there's details that make it more difficult. But we're open, we're transparent. We just had a group from Mexico. Every year we get from Chapingo, east of Mexico City. We We show them what we do. We get people from all over the world, and I think most farmers are pretty transparent in what they do and like to show other people the technology and where we are. So I look at California grown and think that California agriculture does have a bright future. I say that after discussing all the regulations that we're faced with. We do have a quality product, and we're known throughout the world for high quality, safe produce, safe products. And, you know, and that has to do with the regulations that we do have. I just would hope that future regulations allow for grower input and that they're reasonable. You know, that's all we ask for. So I'll end on that note. Thank you.
And please help me welcome Brian Leahy.
So I'm Brian Leahy. I'm the director of California's Department of Pesticide Regulation. Being a regulator is a very fun thing. What I want to do today is kind of briefly go over just who DPR is, and then what our mission is, and then how I think we've made remarkable success in how we use pesticides in California on our farm fields over the last 30, 40 years. And then kind of go for the future, and what I see is really how we're going to make real improvements. First off, though, California's Department of Pesticide Regulation is about 400 individuals. Most of them are scientists. I think 300 of them are classified scientists, well over 100 PhDs. We literally have people with graduate programs from 3 continents. It's a very international group, and I feel really lucky. They're highly educated, they're highly motivated, and they work really well together. It's been part of what we wanted to do. We also have the County Ag Commissioner system, and I should tell you, California is approaching $100 million a year in our regulatory program. It's getting close to what US EPA spends every year. Our County Ag Commissioner system, we give them about $27 million a year to put about 300 biologists in the field and for enforcement and education. So it's going to be one way or the other. Nope. Oh, the one that's wore out, they told me that. Okay, so our mission is really quite simple. As legal pesticides are used, are first and foremost protection of human life. The ag worker, the one that we're worried about most, because we know it has real exposure, is the handlers. The handful of individuals that really touch pesticides on a regular basis. Very, very small percentage of our farm worker community actually is doing that. And we focus a lot on them, and then the professionals, PCAs and whatnot. But as you know, California has gone from a million folks turn of the last century to 40, and we have a lot of neighbors. So we're really worried about not only the farm worker, but then the people in the fields, the farm that aren't applying pesticides. We just want to ensure that the pesticides aren't touching them as they work. And then, of course, the communities. California loves to put schools in the middle of productive farmland. We're looking at that. But protection of human health, first and foremost. Protection of the environment. And, you know, we have a lot of great scientists really looking at environmental fate. What happens to that pesticide as it moves off target and gets into the water streams or the air or wherever, where we have everything from pollinators, so the bees, to endangered species. We've had to deal with some of the pesticides on the urban side that would actually kill the neighbors' pets, and then water quality. And this has really become a really big part of our program. Every time a new pesticide is introduced into California, we get a lot of comments, a lot of push from the water community. They want to ensure that as people take care of ants in their house, that product doesn't end up in the water stream as we're all trying to recycle water. So the environmental fate of pesticides is also a very important part of what we do, and it's becoming more and more so. The way that we've made really remarkable progress in pesticide use is education. You know, people that are handling pesticides in California on the farm side are highly educated. It's licensed, trained professionals. Education works. And this is where I think all the colleges, but particularly the community colleges in these rural areas, can really help us a lot. This is a great job, being a pesticide applicator, being knowledgeable in how you handle pesticides is a good career, and it's also really important. And to take farm workers and to lift them up into a profession is something I think we can really work on. I think most of the folks in this picture, we have county ag commissioners. As I said, we get a lot of the new county ag commissioner biologists. They're first generation in their family to go to college. Many of them are farm workers' kids. You know, this is a place where we really want to encourage our farm workers to go into these other jobs. County ag commissioner, that's Ruben from Kern County. You know, as I said, this is how education works. I can't emphasize that enough. I want to tell you a little bit about progress. This is how we used to do it. You know, the man that taught me how to farm, his first job on the farm was to sew the burlap sacks up and the rice, you know, as they took it to the wagon that was going to pull it out of the field. You know, now we're looking at drones, we're looking at technology. The reality is we're always going to have pests. You know, pests that threaten our food supply, they threaten our public health, they threaten, you know, just our ability to control to do resource management. Pests are not going away. In fact, they're just finding California, and every time we turn around, we have new pests. And so there's a treadmill, but the treadmill is how do we maintain modern society and control pests? And it's going to be through technology, it's through better chemistry. It's also just the simple acknowledgement that to do this pest control, we're going to need to use chemistry, powerful chemistry that we're using to apply to kill something. So what becomes really important is how we apply it and how we keep it on target. And I'm seeing just remarkable technology right now that's in the works, where they're looking at thinning lettuce already planted with chemical, just as they see it. So this is the future. You know, we're going to be able to eliminate the potential for drift in a lot of circumstances, but it's going to take some real technology. A little harder with an almond or something high up in the air, but drones, a lot of technology, I think, is really where we're going to go. And all this technology needs an educated workforce. So, and then the last slide is really about cooperation. As it happens, my wife is a water attorney for the State Water Board. She used to work for the Assembly where she helped write SGMA, but we won't talk about that. But she, you know, she's an attorney for the Water Board. I work in the same agency in the Department of Pesticide Regulation. The reality is the only time you're going to get two departments in the same agency going in the same direction at the same time is on a tandem. But there's reasons for that. You know, our statutes, the laws that govern DPR are different than the laws that govern the Air Board or the Water Board or any other state agency. We have a different approach. You know, ours is a very science approach. You know, we use good science and we use good risk management. You know, and we really try to ground things in that. But each department has different agendas. They have different rules that govern how they can do things. You know, ours is on pesticides. We know that there's going to be issues. That's why we built an incredible, elaborate regulatory system around it, where we know up front before we put new chemistry in what we're looking at and how it's going to behave itself. And then our rule says, you know, our statute says that we need to have maintained if we have substantial harm, we need to do something. And usually what we do is figure out how to mitigate it, to reduce that harm to acceptable levels. We have other departments where, you know, they basically say you can't have impact. Well, you can't have human activity and have no impact. So they're kind of always at odds with their statute. So there's this different worldviews, different statutes, different laws, different approaches that each board has, each department. And you have to remember that this whole regulatory scheme is pretty new. You know, when I was a kid, you could ride your bike up Mount Baldy and you couldn't see it because the air quality was so bad. You know, my friends' dads worked in places like Kaiser in the zinking unit where we had no worker protections. They tended to die young. So the regulations just started coming in when I was growing up. You know, so I have friends that wrote the first water plan that US EPA ever adopted. So we're new. And so as an excuse, we're kind of like kids and we're just starting to figure it out. But what we have to do as a society is figure out how we put regulations in place that don't disrupt industry, but move us forward so that we're protecting human health and the environment, because that's what's really counts. So with that, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm going to take a little different approach than I usually have to do. I usually have to get right into the technical details and discuss all of the ins and outs of what I'm trying to impose on someone, but I thought I'd take a minute in this opportunity and actually back up a step. So I asked myself some simple questions like, you guys probably don't know who I am. I'm just some pencil-headed bureaucrat from Sacramento that doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Yeah? All right, well, here you are. So I grew up on a farm. I went to FFA in high school. I went to Cal Poly and got a degree in agricultural engineering. I worked for a corporate farm up by Firebaugh. Do all of my employees have that background? No, they don't. And that is something that, if I can put in a pitch now for the education system, is we need more people with education to understand that going into regulation is a valuable field to do, and that there's a calling there. And I hope a little bit here to explain exactly why that might be. So I get a lot of the stuff Don talked about and how it all seems to be falling on your head at this moment in time, and that difficulty. I hear that every time I go home for Thanksgiving from my dad. He keeps telling me that if I do one more thing, that I can just send the grandkids home for Christmas. Don't bother coming. So I'm always a little bit tentative about that. You know, so regulators are people too. We have feelings. All right, so why do I regulate? Why do I think regulations are important? Why are we essential? All right, so it's pretty simple. I mean, the purpose of social regulation is the abatement of the control of risk to society. So let me see today if I can make a bit of a case as to why some small portion of the regulation that I am burdening you with actually has a payoff for you and your communities in the future. And before I go to the next step, let me also say that a lot of what we do in the regulatory environment is we expose harms that already exist. All right? The groundwater was going down really fast. People knew that, but we didn't know exactly how much. You know, we have this great tradition in California that goes back to the gold rush days of trying not to ask questions we really don't want an answer to because it might be bad. Unfortunately, those type of operations catch up with you eventually, and so you're faced with either a catastrophic falling off the cliff or an informed path about how you can actually make it sustainable and end up in a better scenario. And Tom can pay me later for the lead into sustainability there. So and I think the same happens is available in nitrogen. So let me I'm just going to throw up some pictures here. This is a graph that was from a State Water Board report. You can see the counties along the bottom there, and these are the number of communities that rely on contaminated water. I mean, they're drinking water, their water source is known to be contaminated, and they're struggling with that. The red part of the bars means that they're 100% reliant on groundwater, so they don't have alternate sources to go to. So there's some counties right around here. The big one there to the left, other than Los Angeles, which has a mixed source, is Kern, second one, with 87 known communities. And this is actually dated. This is a report from about 5 years ago. If you look at this same graph a little bit differently, you can also break it out by what are the size of those communities. So, you know, it's important to understand kind of what you're talking about community-wise. Some communities can handle an impact like that. They can afford treatment, they have a large enough system to disperse it and bear the costs associated with now having to treat for that source. The light blue ones are where the systems are less than 3,300 people. Really hard to start to afford expensive, sophisticated water treatment when you get to that small level. And that's what we see a lot in the valley. It's the smallest communities that are the most disadvantaged, that are the most burdened by contaminated groundwater and other contaminated drinking water sources. So you're gonna ask me, what are the contaminations? This graph is from that same report where we broke out what the different contaminations were, and sorry you can't actually read all of it, but I can tell you that the first orange bar, or the second bar there, to the left is nitrate. So that certainly is pertinent for why they invited me. I work on the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program petition at the State Board. So I think that's a very telling case. The largest one there is arsenic, a naturally occurring contaminant, of course. But we see actually some of it being, higher levels of it occurring as water gets drawn down. Our aquifers change. Some of the chemistry in them can change. So there's some level increase. It also means people are going to sources that are deeper as they chase the surface, the groundwater as it goes down, and our deeper water also tends to be a little more heavy in arsenic. So there's some other trends there, even though it's naturally occurring, that are indicative of how our communities are having to struggle. So those were communities. What about actual wells? We don't know certainly everybody's private drinking water well. How many people test their drinking water well at their domicile, their ranch, to know what's in it? Yeah, that's usually what I get. I had a couple hands. Our former board chairman, Charlie Hoppen, who was a farmer, or is a farmer, and was board chair for us for quite some time, always, every time he sees me, he grabs me and says, you know, you're the reason I pay $1,500 every couple years to have my well tested, because you basically showed this information to me, and it changed my approach to understand that there are drinking water wells. This map here with the red dots, those are all wells. We have 42,000 in this data set that were monitored for one reason or another. They're usually community drinking water wells. Some of them are wells that were put in specifically for testing. But you can see where the nitrate contamination is above the drinking water standard. So those wells should not be serving drinking water, and some of them probably are. If you jump to the next one, this map is basically the same thing, except now it shows where the nitrate levels are at half. So they're on their way to being contaminated. That's about 5 parts per million of a nitrate tested as in. The other one was when it was at 10. If you understand that natural background on nitrogen, you know, my rule of thumb is if it's over 2, then it's pretty much anthropogenic and man-made. Somehow we cause that nitrogen contamination to be there. The natural systems tend to be at a much, much lower level. That's the end of my pictures. When I was listening earlier, you know, there was a lot of talk about a lot of the nitrogen contamination is from historic practices, and there's no question about that. It takes a long time for certain areas for the groundwater, the percolation under the root zone to actually make it to groundwater, and certainly I think some of the worst contamination we have is from that. But let me throw out this little fact for you. So what level, how much nitrogen do you or can you lose and not be a contaminant for future drinking water? It's actually really, really low. So if you lose, say you deep perk below your root zone 6 inches of water per acre, you, on that per acre basis, can only lose 5 pounds of nitrogen. That's it. If you are over 5 pounds of nitrogen on that acre, in essence, the concentration of that 6 inches of perk will be above the drinking water standard. It's that low of a level. So it's a really small amount of nitrogen. So yes, the past practices probably contributed a large component to it. And a lot of those are even in the Vado zone, still working their way down for the next 20, 30 years. But a lot of our current practices are still in trouble when it comes to maintaining water quality. And so we still have a lot of work to do even as good as we've gotten, to continue to improve along that line. So I think the other thing that is a great theme here is that why now? Why did this all come about just recently, and why are all of these things compacting? And as I look at a bit of that, the first State Water Board nitrate report on addressing ag and nitrate was actually written in 1989. And if you read it now, and you read it knowing what we know now and knowing what we know then, the only thing we know different is basically the maps and the scale of what I presented to you. The rest of it is still amazingly pertinent. It's just that we didn't have the information to be able to make a strong case on how pervasive was it, where was it all at, and so we ourselves as a regulated entity are a victim of the technology increase and the amount of information that comes at us, just as any business or farming interest is going forward. I guess the place to kind of end on is, can we do better? And I always operate from the standpoint of absolutely. Never for a second have I said our regulations were perfect or that what we're doing right now is what we should be doing forever. But it's always a communicative process back and forth between the regulated community, the regulators. We learn from each other. We want you to stay in business. We want to maintain healthy ecosystems. Those are the places that you live. Those are the communities that your kids are in. And so, we want to work together in that aspect. So, to me, it's always a bit of a humanizing impact to understand that. Am I more worried about being judged by someone's reaction to what we have in front of us now? No, I always try to think, what will my kids tell me is most important, and what I failed to do. And so a lot of times when faced with gee, can you just wait a little while, or why are you regulating this now? The thought that always comes to my mind is sitting there when my kids would come back to me and say, why didn't you save us from this thing that you knew existed, or why didn't you take action, earlier? And so that always motivates me a bit to get into it. And I think all of this stuff, both from the regulatory side, where we will obviously, technology got us to this stage, it's going to increase our need to move forward, and it's going to be this back and forth between the regulated entities going to need technology and well-trained information workers that can handle it, because in the end, it's all about how we use this information as a society as a whole to both advance our businesses, maintain the place we love to live, and have a society that my kids won't blame me that I let it get screwed up on. So, thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Please help me welcome Tom Tomac.
Okay. Hey, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Tom Tomac. I'm not a regulator. I have kind of a hybrid job. Half of my time is as a professor in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at UC Davis. Being a professor at UC Davis in that college is one of the great privileges for anybody in academia. The other half of my time is working with Glenda Humiston on our statewide programs in agriculture. So I have both the advancing knowledge and the advancing practice part. I'm really grateful to Chancellor Gornick and others who organized this. If there's anything I say that you find useful or interesting, thank Bob Gore. I think Bob's the reason I'm here. I'm responsible for anything you don't like, I might say. I'm happy to talk about nitrogen. We've got material on it, but I actually wanted to cast this a bit broader. One of the great privileges of my job is, my job is to really take the long view, to look out 10, 20 years about what do we need to be anticipating and get started on it now so that when we need to deal with it, we're ready. That is a great privilege. It's also a great privilege to be on this panel with Don Cameron. When I came back to California 10 years ago, people like Don Cameron, John Diener, Stuart Wolf, John Harris, I could go on and on, names you'd recognize, were the people that took time to sit down and talk with me about, well, what are the issues? Where do we need to go? And there's plenty of these things. Some of them came up this morning, like salinity. We're not really taking seriously enough yet, but we know about it. So, but the other thing is, it was in Dawn's talk, and it's this question of time. And we have big problems that need, and opportunities and challenges. But one of the things that's not understood about agriculture is the time scale, whether it's seasonality or years. And part of the problem now is we're playing catch up too fast on too many things. So I feel that it's a really bad sign when people like Don Cameron or John Diener or Stuart Wolf or John Harris or countless others are talking about feeling overwhelmed by regulation. And we've got to make sure that those folks and all the other folks are going to be having healthy businesses next year and in the future to be able to actually address these long-term things. So there's a short-term challenge of making sure we don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg, to use that metaphor, but also to set the foundation for the future. I should say this means a lot to me personally because my family has been farming in the Sacramento Valley. 2017 will be 120 years for us. 2017 could also be the year that we decide to throw in the towel. That's a succession problem, but there's a lot of issues about this. So I get it. But my job on this panel is to say, okay, how do we look forward with this? So 6 points. First of all, in agriculture, context is everything. So let me say 3 things about a broader context. Secretary Ross started the conversation. Dawn mentioned it, this whole issue of California's brand. California is viewed by the rest of the world as a leader in innovation, in agricultural innovation, in environmental regulation innovation, food safety regulation. Other people, when I was working outside, I was in Kenya at that time and decided to come back to California to serve here. My colleagues from Africa, Asia, Latin America all said, we understand why you want to go back and serve where you were born, but please stay in touch because we want to know what's going on in California. They didn't say we want to know what's going on in the US. They were very specific. They said we want to know what's going on in California. Because they use lessons from our experience and adapt them in their own places. The other thing that is very new is Bloomberg issued a report last week about the skyrocketing investments in sustainable agriculture venture capital. Admittedly growing from a very small base, but increasing very quickly. Now, Olivier from Powwow Energy is here. There could be tremendous opportunity, but I think Olivier would agree with me, and part of our experience in all of this has been Silicon Valley speaks a language, Central Valley speaks a language. Some of us at the University of California speak Central Valley, but not all of us. Olivier stands out in my mind because he's willing to take the time to come over to things like this. There are a lot of folks who have money and talent but don't understand agriculture, and there's a lot of opportunity in there. But again, it's another thing that's going to take time. And the third contextual thing is, won't surprise any Californians, but internationally, there's a lot of talk about the energy, food, water nexus. And the point has already been made that our problems are global, that we're not unique in these challenges. Things are changing fast. Information technology, sensors are coming. Costs are going down. Dawn, you mentioned just this. We're going from being data constrained to data flooded. The people who can actually be coherent and use that information are the people that are going to compete effectively. We're having actually the first international meeting on exactly this issue of creating the Internet of Food. So to make coherence out of this flood of data, it's going to happen in Davis next week. So California's got a brand that's about innovation. there are ag tech innovation opportunities, and there's this particular cluster of stuff around energy, water, and food that the world understands. Let me talk about the implications of that, and again, just 3 points. But Olivier is not the only innovator in the room. Farmers are innovators, and I want to talk about the implications of these broad contextual perspectives for farmers as innovators. And this may be the statement I make that Bob Gore is going to want to disavow, but what I'm going to say is that farmers and ranchers and people in agribusiness actually have a strong interest in policy and smart policy. Let me give you 3 reasons that immediately came to my mind for why folks here, farmers here, should want policy. One is to create the incentives for early adoption and innovation to address some of these things. Because if you think about the climate, water, food nexus, I'm an economist. Markets are fantastic on commodities, but on some other things, especially natural resources, they don't work so well. And whether you're a venture capitalist who's interested in water in Silicon Valley, or you're a farmer out here whose livelihood depends on water, there is inevitably a policy component to the water aspect. So we need smart policies to open up and create the incentives for farmer-led innovation, whether it's water use efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the whole area of bioenergy and biomass as feedstock for energy. Second, California needs innovation to sustain its competitive advantage in the world. I mentioned the California brand that is recognized. People are following us. We had the 2 research leaders from France come to Davis last week. They just came directly to Davis. They didn't stop on the East Coast. They said their objective is that French agricultural research would be where Davis is now. The French would be there in 10 years. Okay? We've got to keep that kind of advantage. Now, how does Davis get to become one of the top 2 research institutions on the planet? Part of the reason I think that we are so innovative, and my colleague Ed mentioned the translational part of it is a key. It's because we work with the smartest, most innovative farmers and ranchers on the planet. That's a huge aspect of our comparative advantage. So policy that makes sure that we're taking advantage of our own comparative advantage in innovation is going to be the key to the future profitability of ag. Finally, and this is something that I don't think gets enough attention, but in a competitive system like California, and we know central planning doesn't work for food and agriculture. That experiment has been run at great cost by the Soviet Union and Communist China. Agriculture is a market-based competitive system. In a competitive system, without policies that level the playing field and create the incentives to reward people for innovation in water, energy, food production, the people who are the good stewards of environment and resources are at a competitive disadvantage to the people who are not. So policy can also start to level the playing field that for folks like Don Cameron, who's a leader in this area. So I'll stop with that.